Hello, my name is Carol McCoy. I have the pleasure of interviewing Bob Ballow today, January 23rd, 2018, in his offices at 315 Union Street in the law firm of King and Ballow. This interview is being conducted for the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association and the Nashville Bar Foundation. Bob, I'd like you to please tell us your full name, your birth date, and where you were born.
My full name is Robert Lee Ballow, and I was born August the 18th, 1931 in Nashville, Tennessee.
And do you recall who your grandparents were?
Yeah, well, my grandparents, I was raised by my grandparents, and they were, the name was Dunn, and we lived out in South Nashville.
Whereabouts?
On Carroll Street. In fact, they tore our home place down to build the slums.
Oh. Did you have any brothers and sisters?
No.
So you were an only child?
My mother and father were divorced shortly after I was born.
And did your mother stay close with you? Or?
Yeah, well, she couldn't raise me. She was young, 17 years old, and my grandmother raised me.
And what are some of your first recollections as a young child?
You know, I think really the wisdom of my grandmother, who was an uneducated person, but the way she raised me and the things she taught me, I never knew her to go to church, but she read her Bible every day. She made it a point to teach me how to pray, and made sure from the time I can remember that I was in the Baptist church on Carroll Street. And
what was her name?
her name was Dunn.
Her first name? Her first name?
Maddie.
And you just called her?
I called her Granny.
And as you were growing up, what were some of your duties in the house, and who were some of your friends in the neighborhood?
Well, I did have one special friend, a boy named Bobby Kincaid. We were very close, but we lived in, if you're familiar with Nashville, that's a very poor section of town. And we spent our time shooting marbles and playing. And I guess the most important thing about my childhood was that my grandmother, although she didn't have an education, she was very insistent that I went to Howard School, and she was very insistent that I...
Was that grade school?
It was grade school. I went there through the fourth grade, and then my grandfather died, and I went to live with my mother, who had remarried, and we lived in Inglewood.
Okay.
But I think the real thing was she wanted to be sure I got a good education. And fortunately, back then, the public schools were good.
Did she teach you how to read?
No, I don't guess. I guess I learned it in school, but she was very big on reading the Bible, and she read the Bible every day, although I said I never knew her to go to church. But she read the Bible every day, and she made a big deal over teaching me how to pray.
Do you have any memories of some of your first teachers?
Yeah, I sure do.
Who were they?
Well, my first teacher in first grade was named Miss Schimmer. I don't know how you spell it, but I went to Howard School.
Down here on Second?
Yeah. And,
where the Fulton Center complex
well,
is?
The thing in my first year of school, about halfway through, the building started sinking into the ground. So they canceled school for the year, and we all went home. And didn't go back till the next year. They built the new Howard School, which is out there now, but it's not school. And then in my second grade, I had a lady by the name of Miss Rose, and they were all really good teachers. You know, this may be a little unfair, but I don't know about the educational system today, but back then the teachers were really dedicated. and they would take interest in you. And I can remember we had two reading groups. One was a little slower than the other, and the faster group. And I remember as just a little kid, they would let me help with a slower group reading, which was responsibility.
Right.
And they were very dead. And then I had my third grade teacher was a lady by the name of Sawyer, Miss Sawyer. And the fourth grade teacher, I can't remember the name, but then I transferred and went to Jerry Baxter, which is out in Inglewood.
Right.
And I finished grammar school there.
Where did you move to in Inglewood?
Huh?
Where did you move to in Inglewood?
I moved on a street called Zophie Street. It's one street on out beyond Trinity Lane.
Okay.
And then from Jerry Baxter, I went to Isaac Litton.
Did you play any sports in
No,
school?
I carried a paper route.
How young were you when you started a paper route?
Well, I started selling papers on the street when I was 8 years old.
For how much?
It's a nickel a copy
For which paper?
for either one of them. And
Nashville, Tennessean,
the
and
Nashville
the Banner?
Tennessean and the Nashville Banner. And back then, it was just when streetcars were leaving the scene and they were putting buses on. And I used to get on a bus and ride 2 or 3 blocks and sell my newspapers to the people on the bus. Then I'd get off across the street, catch a bus going back the other way, sell papers there. And
How old were you?
I was eight or 9.
How much did you make?
Oh, well, back then, you know,
Nickel went a long way, but
yeah, I mean, you know, I'd probably make 50 or 60 cents a day.
and other than selling newspapers and going to school, did you have any other activities?
There wasn't any time for anything else because I carried papers both in the morning and in the evening. And I had to get my papers when I was in grammar school. I had to get my papers around 4:30 in the morning.
How did it work? You made 50, 60 cents a day, and you're getting a nickel a paper. Did you buy the papers from the newspaper?
Yeah.
How'd that work?
Well, you would buy the papers, and I'm not sure of this, but I believe it was about 3 cents that I paid, and on each paper I sold, I made 2 cents. But that's when I was 8 or 9.
Did it change?
Oh, yeah, as it went on, yeah. In fact, when I moved to East Nashville, I was 10 or 11 years old. But when I was 11, I went on the payroll of the Nashville newspapers for $3.25 a week. And my job was, I wasn't old enough to carry a paper out, but my job was,
You weren't old enough at 11 to have a paper route,
they
but you
wouldn't
were
give you
doing
a
it
route
at 8?
until you were 12.
Oh. So how did you do it at 8?
Well, I was selling on the street. I didn't have a route.
Oh.
That was just street selling.
You could do that.
And I actually did that. There was another fella got the papers and let me have them.
I see.
And that's the way I did it. But they paid me $3.25 a week to clean up the paper corner after all the carriers left, because they usually left the papers at a service station or a grocery store or something. And if you didn't clean up the corner, the person that owned the grocery store or the service station wouldn't let you leave the papers there anymore.
I see.
So my job was to go from corner to corner to clean up. Then shortly after that, I turned 12 years old, which would have been in 1943, and the war was going on. And I got a paper out of my own out in East
Were you in the
Nashville.
6th grade then?
I was in the 5th or 6th, yeah, about the 6th grade.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then you had a regular job.
Well, I had the regular job, but I also had the paper route.
Okay.
And the paper route was a great education. I mean, really and truly, people don't. It's a shame that newspapers have evolved as they have, because.
Tell me a little bit about that experience and what you thought.
Well, the people learning to deal with people, and
Did you have to collect on a weekly basis?
collect it on a weekly basis. learning the experience you have. I had a good route. I had Fairwind, Carolyn, and Cahal streets. It was supposed to be the best route in Nashville, and I believe it was. I know it was the biggest, and I learning to deal with the people, and I know that I made lifelong friends that were my customers on the paper route. In fact, my wife and I, my wife died 14 years ago, but prior to her death, I was sitting in a restaurant out in Gallatin, where I live now, and some guy that he looked to be about my age, but he walked up by and he said, "Are you Bob Ballow?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Are you still carrying that paper out?" I said, "No, I gave it up a couple of years ago." And he said, "What do you do now?" I said, "Well, I practice law." And he said, "Well, you know, he was one of my subscribers." But as I said, he didn't look any older than I was. But you just made lifelong friends. And I remember when I was sworn in as a lawyer, I guess because I was working at the newspaper, they put my picture on the front page of being sworn in. I think every subscriber I had as a kid called me on the telephone, every one of them. So it was a great experience, and you learn how to deal with people. And I go in a restaurant today, and they don't know how to make change because they got a machine now.
That's right.
But when I was a kid, if somebody said, I haven't got the change, I said, "What have you got?" I could figure out a way to make the change so I get paid. And today it's completely different.
Did you ever have any customers who didn't pay you on time?
Oh, yeah. I sure did.
What did you do?
Well, you know, it's a different experience. I would say that I probably had as good a paying route as anybody, but I won't call any names, but I had one fellow one time, he and his wife were getting a divorce or something, and I was leaving his paper, and I knew they were having problems. And so I just kept delivering the paper for his wife. He had two little girls. And then one morning I saw him coming out of the house about 5 o'clock in the morning, and he was a prominent businessman. And I told him I wanted to collect on the paper. And of course it was 2 or 3 months, so he thought it was going to be just a week or something. And he said, "How much I owe you?" So when I told him how much he owed me, it was more than he expected. And he said, "Well, I don't even live here." And I said, "I don't know about that." I said, "I'm delivering the paper for you." And he said, "Well, get the money the best way you can." And I said, that's fine. So I just kept leaving the lady a paper, and she eventually paid me. But ironically enough, after I got married, I had occasion to do business with that fellow. I didn't intend to do it. Somebody else made the arrangement. And the business, he came to my house. I'd built a new house out in Hillwood. And he came and did some work, and he didn't do it right. And my wife knew he didn't do it right. I knew it. So I found out that someone else had made the arrangements for him to do work at my house. I never would have agreed to it. But when I found out that he had done the work, I was pleased, because I said, I owed him what he did was several $100s. And I said, "That's just fine." I said, "Because when he comes to get his money, I'm just going to tell him to get his money the best way he can." And I'll never forget it. My wife said, "Well, that'll be smart, because that'll make you the same kind of person he is." And I said, I paid him his money and forgot about it. But she said, "You do that and you'll be the same kind of person he is."
A very, very wise lady.
So I decided to give him a check and forget about it.
Let me go back to high school for just a minute. You're at Isaac Litton. Did you have any classes that you really liked?
Oh yeah, we had back then. We just had public education was good, and I think you ask anybody, they would say Isaac Litton was one of the best public schools in town. And I enjoyed all my work in high school, and I carried that paper out, but I was in school every day. I don't think in high school I don't think I missed but couple of days the whole 4 years. And I had a great English teacher and a great history teacher, and I enjoyed every one of them. And I got in a little trouble one time, I'll never forget it. We had a principal by the name of J.K. Brown. And I got in trouble in my homeroom, and my homeroom teacher suggested that I leave the homeroom and not come back. And Mr. Brown said, well, you're going to have to find a homeroom or you can't go to school here. I thought, well, so I went to my history teacher, who was a lady named Ms. Moss. She lived in Gallatin. And I told her my problem, and I had a good relationship. And she said, well, I'll let you be in my homeroom, but you've got to make 100 on every history test. And I had American history and world history under her. And she probably helped me a little bit, but I did make 100 on all of them, because I had any choice. She had to press, as you know, I negotiated a lot of labor contracts, and the one thing I know is when you negotiate, no matter what it is, you got to have some leverage, or you got to make some leverage.
Right.
And if anybody ever had any leverage, she had it.
That's,
Because if I couldn't be in our homeroom, I was gone.
what did you do that got you kicked out of homeroom? That must have been a really
Well,
humdinger.
this lady, as I got older, I realized she had problems at home. She would come to school and she would be black and blue from her domestic problems. And I never knew. She really kind of took a disliking to me, I guess you'd say. And this is kind of bad to tell, but at Christmas time in homeroom, we would exchange gifts. And somebody in the class gave a very popular girl a pair of black bloomers. And she opened them, and guess who got accused of doing it?
You.
Me, but I didn't do it. I know who did it, but I didn't do it. And so she suggested that I leave the class. No proof. She just suggested I leave the class.
What year were you in school then? 10th grade?
That was my freshman year. I was in the 9th grade, and that would have been 46 and 47th school year.
And they left it up to you to figure out how to stay in school?
No, she took me down to the principal's office, and he was sympathetic with me, but he couldn't show it. And he just said, okay,
Got to find another.
you got to find another homeroom.
When you got ready to graduate, it was probably towards the end of the war?
1950. No, the war was over in 45.
45. So you started high school in 46. Okay. And at the end of high school, what did you do?
At the end of high school, I started to college at George Peabody College. And
Why did you pick Peabody?
I don't guess I had a real reason for selecting it. It wasn't, it was a little different. I didn't have any money to go to school.
Did you want to be a teacher?
No.
But that's what
teacher.
George Peabody...
I wanted, at that time in my life, I wanted to carry a paper route the rest of my life. I made really good money because at that time...
How much were you making then?
Oh, I was making, back in those days, I was making a lot of money for...
A high school kid.
Well, right after I got out of high school, I got a motor route. And back then, that was a really big deal. My motor route was everything between Leland Lane and Granny White Pike, out to Outer Creek, back through Outer Creek to Hillsborough Road, and then back through Tyne Boulevard. And of course, there wasn't much out there then.
That's a lot of
But
driving.
my route probably paid me $10,000 a year in 1950.
As a high school student.
And that's when college professor was making $3,000. So, but I had to get up at 1:30 in the morning and get my papers at 2 o'clock. And then I got off my route about 6, went to the Tuttle House, had breakfast, and then went to school.
Tuttle House is like a Waffle House?
Huh?
Tuttle House is like a Waffle House?
Yeah, it was right out there, I guess about 25th and West End. And then I'd go to school and I'd be back at the newspaper at 1 and 1:30.
You were over on West End and you had to go to school over at Isaac Litton?
No, I was at Isaac Litton.
Oh.
I was going to Peabody and
When you were in Peabody, okay.
and taking
Okay.
some classes at Vanderbilt. Back then, you could register at Peabody for $4.25 a quarter hour.
Wow.
And Vanderbilt was $8 a quarter hour, about twice as much at Peabody. But you could register at Peabody and take your classes at Vanderbilt.
Wow.
So I did that, and I guess that's why they put the two schools together.
What did you major in?
I majored in economics and history, and I never, it sounds kind of bad, but I really and truly, I had such a good deal at the newspaper. I thought, I'm going to carry this paper out the rest of my life. And I really didn't go to school thinking I want to be this or I want to be that, which is kind of bad, I guess. But
Why did you, I know probably why you picked history, because you were good in history and you liked it.
That's right.
Why did you pick economics?
They had a guy there named Dr. Ward, and he was really an extremely well-known professor. And he did a lot of, he taught money and banking, he taught labor problems, and I did well in his class. And I guess, I won't say it was easy for me, but I didn't have to work too hard to make good grades. So I stayed, I just stayed in, and that was it.
Now, I'm picturing you going to college, getting up at 1:30, delivering your papers. You're not really interacting with a lot of people at the newspaper corporation except to get your papers. You're obviously a good employee because you've risen up and now you have this motor route. What was your relationship like with the people who ran the newspapers?
Well, they were very good. They kind of felt that they had raised me. And the very fact that, senators tried to get their sons motor routes. It was an extremely well-paying job. And
you had great route.
huh?
You had a great route.
Oh, the best. Both publishers lived on the route, and they knew me and I knew them, and if they had any kind of problem, they would call me. And so when I carried the paper route, the interchange with the people that owned the place, I carried their paper, so I knew them, I knew me.
How did you get a car to do this?
How did I get a car? That's a really good question. I had a car, and I had a car because I carried a paper out in high school, and I made good money doing that. But I had a car, but when they told me they were going to give me the motor route, it was in the summer of 1950. And I was going down to get my papers. I had a walking route, and the manager's name was Cleo Barbie. And Cleo called me over to the car, and he said, "Ballow, what are you going to do now? School's out." And I said, "Well, I don't know, I'd like to go to college, but I ain't got any money. And he said, would you want a motor route? And I like to fell out. I said, yeah. He said, well, come down to the office in the morning and we'll talk about it. So I went down to the office and I met with the head man in circulation, and we talked, and they said, we're going to give you this route. And that was a pretty significant thing. But they said, you got to have $2,500 because you pay your bill every week, but you just collect once a month. So you got to have $2,500. And I said, man, I ain't got $2,500. Back then, that was an annual salary for a pressman. And Cleo, my manager, said, don't worry about it. I said, okay. And then he told him he got the money. I didn't have the money.
He advanced it.
So after we got through, he said, come on, we'll go to lunch. And we got in his car, and we went to lunch. And then he took me out. They had just opened a branch of the Third National Bank on Galton Road. And he took me in there. And the guy's name, who was the manager, was named George Bevins. And he was really a young guy. And Cleo said, we want to borrow $2,500 on a 90-day note, and I'll sign the note. And that's the way I got the $2,500.
What kind of car did you have at that time?
I had a 1948 Model Ford.
And you bought that working in high school?
Oh, yeah.
And is that the car you used for the motor route?
Oh, no. You would wear a car out. I had 2 or 3 cars on the motor route, but I carried the motor route till I went in the service. But when I was in high school, we had a Spanish teacher by the name of Robert Maxwell. And Robert Maxwell was a warrant officer in the Navy. And so that we would all do well in Spanish, when we were about 16, we all went over and joined the Naval Reserves. And once a month, we'd go on, I think, Tuesday night to the Naval Reserve meeting. And so that's how I went into the Navy. I didn't get drafted. I got in the Navy. They don't call you in by groups. They call you billet in, and that's what happened to me.
So you signed up for going to the Naval Reserves in high school.
Yeah.
When did you do that all through college, Naval Reserves?
Yeah.
And did you see active duty at some point?
The only active duty I saw was in Memphis on Beale Street. Used to be a lot of fights down there, and that's the only active duty I saw. But no, I went in the service, and because I had been in the Naval Reserves, that time counted.
Right.
And I went to, it was kind of interesting. I was in the hospital corps, and I didn't want to be in the hospital corps, but that's where my Spanish teacher was. So I figured I got to go along with this. So when I went in, they wanted me to go fly airplanes, and I didn't want to go fly airplanes. And so they told me I had to go to hospital corps school, and I objected to that. And they said, okay, you got to go around and be interviewed by 3 doctors. And so I went around, and fortunately, I found a doctor who had gone to Vanderbilt. And I explained my circumstances. He wrote the nicest letter for me, saying that I would make a fine contribution, but I did not belong in the hospital corps. And that's when I learned where the power in the United States Navy was. It's with second-class petty officers. I took my letter back to this fellow, and I was so tickled because I thought, well, he said, boy, this is really fine. I said, I appreciate it, put it down. 10 days later, I got orders for the hospital corps school.
Now, how did Gail Robinson get in the?
Well, Gail was in the hospital corps too.
Y'all went to school together.
Yeah, we went to school together at Peabody, and it was really a good experience. The ironic thing, just to show that you sometimes don't do it, I went to that corps school, and it was 6 or 7 months at Portsmouth, Virginia. One of the greatest experiences I had. There were about 500 people in there, and back then in the service, you know, they didn't care too much about who you were. They'd take anybody. In fact, if you got in trouble and went in front of the judge, he would say, well, I'm going to put you in the state penitentiary for 3 years, or you can join the service. And we had a whole lot of those in there. But the school was really good. And I know that
Now, what time frame is this that you're going to the school for 6 months?
53.
You were still in college.
Yeah, well, I got a billet, and they required me to
Come.
come.
So you take 6 months out of college.
Yeah, and so anyway, I did, and in the school, it was interesting because if you didn't make it in that school, every Friday, they had a group down at the quartermaster's shack, and that group was destined to hang over the side of a ship and chip paint for the rest of their career in the Navy. So it was a great incentive to do well in school. And about the second week there, they announced that if you were in the top 5 in this class, you could pick your duty station, go anywhere you wanted to. Man, I went to work.
Incentive.
And so when I got through with school, I got to pick my duty station. And I picked Memphis, Tennessee. And
That's a great naval station.
it was a great naval. And I had a good experience there. I wasn't probably
How many naval officers and staff were there? I can't imagine it's very big.
Oh, it was pretty big. See, they had the hospital there, and then they had the the north side and south side, and it was a pretty big thing. Yeah, it was. I really wouldn't have any idea how many people, but it was big, and it was.
How long were you there?
Huh?
How long were you there?
22 months and 18 days. Not that I was counting.
And what was your rank?
Well, I made. You have to be in a certain time before you can take the test to advance. But all of my time in the reserves counted. And so in school, I was a third-class petty officer, which in the Army, that would be equal to a sergeant.
Okay.
And nobody understood why I was a third-class petty officer, because everybody else was just gone in the Navy. And so it was fortunate, because any time they was going to name a man in charge, I got to be the man in charge. So when they were mopping the deck or buffing the deck, I sat in the chair and watched them. And it was a good deal. And the whole experience really turned out to be really good. I didn't have any idea I wanted to stay in the Navy, because my whole goal was to get out of the Navy and come home and go to work for the newspaper.
Right. And while you were down there, was Gail down there with you?
Gail and I were there together.
And did you have any conflicts or invasions while you were there?
In what respect?
Well, I think you said before we started this that when people kind of do ride your military service.
Oh, well, we joked a lot about it, because when people would say, you know, were you in the military? I'd say, yeah. They say, where were you stationed? I said, Memphis, Tennessee. And they kind of get a laugh out of that, but then I say, well, you may laugh, but when Gail Robinson and I were in Memphis, no Koreans came up the Mississippi River while we were there. And that's true.
Okay, so now you do your your service, your 22 months and 18 days? Not that
Yes.
anybody's counting.
Yeah.
Where'd you go after that?
Well, I came home, and I
Finished.
went back to work for the newspaper, and they made me. I got out of the Navy on a Wednesday, and came home, and on Thursday, I went to Gail Robinson and Willie Castleman, who were in Cumberland Law School, and I went up there with them to class and to register to go to law school there.
Now, when did you finish college? When was that?
In March of '53,
Oh, was that March of 53?
when I went into service.
You went into service,
Yeah.
and then 55, 56 is when you started Cumberland?
Yeah. Well, I didn't start at Cumberland.
Oh, what
I
happened?
just went up there with them to register. And then I came home, and Willie's wife was married then to Catherine Bers. And she
I
fixed us
remember
lunch,
Catherine.
and I went out to Vanderbilt to register to go to school there.
Oh,
And that was all on the same day. And I had decided, without any problems, that I never was going to get married. That I didn't know many people who were married who were happy. And I had a great job at the newspaper, making really good money. And the day I got out of the service, a day before I got out of the service, I bought the sharpest automobile that's ever hit the streets of Nashville. It was a 1954 Chevrolet hardtop convertible. It was red, and it had a real Continental kit on the back end, not an imitation one. And I figured this is the greatest life you could have. I'm making more money than any of my friends, and had this wonderful automobile, and everything was going fine. And I met this little blonde-headed girl.
where'd y'all
who was
meet?
a stewardess. She was a stewardess for American Airlines. Well, what happened, a girl I went to high school with, Bunny Cantrell, called and said, Bob, Betty Sue, my sister, has gone to stewardess school with this girl from Franklin, Kentucky. And she's in Nashville, and she's staying with us till she can find an apartment. And she said, she doesn't know anybody, and I want you to take her out on a date. And I said, well, I don't do that. And I used a term that I lived with the rest of my married life. I said, I don't buy a pig in a poke. And so I'll tell you what I will do. I'll get her a date with Miller Cheek. Did you ever know Miller?
Did not know Miller.
Miller was with Third National Bank. And my purpose in doing that was twofold. I wanted to get this girl a date, and I wanted to break Miller and the girl he was dating up. I wanted to break them up.
Why?
So, well, she just, in my judgment, she wasn't for him.
You were looking out for him.
Although they got married and lived together 60 years. My judgment on it wasn't too good. But anyway, we had a double date. I dated a girl named Kitty Johnson. And do you know Michelle Johnson?
Yes, I do.
Was her aunt, and there was a story in the paper about her, Kitty being her favorite aunt. Kitty was an absolutely beautiful girl, a very devout Catholic, and just a beautiful girl and a wonderful, wonderful person. I had a date with her, and Miller had a date with my wife. And I realized shortly after we got to where we were going that I might have made a mistake, that I probably should have not done that. So after we went through that experience, I called Miller and I tell him, you call that girl and get another date. And he kept saying, well, I called her, but she dating some pilot or something. And I said, I thought he was just telling me that. But anyway, after about 2 or 3 weeks, I called her up on the phone. Her name was Betty Lee. And I called her up to get a date for a Saturday night. She said, well, I'm sorry, but I won't be able to go because I've got to go home Saturday night. We're giving a shower for a friend of mine on Sunday in Bowling Green. And said, I have to go home, and I have to ride a Greyhound bus home. She didn't have a car. And she said, but I would like to go. But I said, we have the date, I'll take you home. And she said, well, it's in Franklin, Kentucky. I said, that's all right. So we did that. I did it.
You drove up to Franklin.
And when I was leaving her house, her home in Franklin, Kentucky, I come out on the road, and it was about 15 minutes after midnight, and my car quit running. It overheated. My brand new super Chevrolet quit running, and I thought, Lord, what'll I do at 12:15 in Franklin, Kentucky? And this is, to me, the most interesting story. I was standing on the side of the road with my hood up, and a car pulled up. It had 2 couples in it, and they said, they were from somewhere up in, I believe in Indiana somewhere. And they said, what's the problem? I said, I don't know, my car just quit running. And we got to talking, and they were veterans. And we got to talking. I said, I just got out of the Navy and bought this car. And they said, well, get in the car and we'll push you to the nearest service station. I said, man, that's going to be in White House, Tennessee. And that's a long way. And he said, don't worry, we'll do it. And they got in there and pushed my car to White House. And there was a little old Pico structure. There wasn't anything in White House then. And we stopped and got out, and the guy came out and said, it's your fan belts broke. And I said, well, I'll buy. He said, we don't have one. We ain't got one. I said, well, I thanked those fellas, and I said, I really appreciate what you've done, and I'll call somebody from Nashville. They said, no, get in there, we'll push you all on into Nashville.
Oh, my goodness.
They pushed me all the way into Dixon Road out there to a Pan Am station that was operated by a friend of mine that went to Lytton, Doug Lanham, and Doug had a thing. I tried to pay those guys. They wouldn't take a penny. They did let me buy them a tank of gas. But who ever heard of something like that? Pushed me all the way from Franklin, Kentucky. And really, they were veterans, and they were going to some veterans meeting in New Orleans. And they did it. So I got to thinking about that during the week, and I thought I must be crazy to have agreed to do that and take that girl home. But the next weekend, I had another date with her, and after that, I never dated anybody else. She was the one.
You must have changed your mind about getting married, too.
Yeah, I certainly did. In fact, it didn't take long. My wife never liked for me to tell this, but it was just about 3 or 4 weeks till I proposed. And she did not say yes. And she said, let's just wait. People will think we're crazy. I said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to wait. And so it was a Wednesday night, and I left, and with the intent of never going back, because I said, this is not going to end up good. And that was on a Wednesday night, and I didn't hear any on Thursday. On Friday, she called me at the office, and she said, I tried to call yesterday, but I just got out of the Navy. My name wasn't in the phone book or anything. So she called me at the office, and she said, you need to come back out here today and we need to talk. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. Let's just forget it. And she said, well, she agreed to marry me on the telephone, but said, let's just wait a short time. I said, fine. That was probably in April, or no, it was probably in May, and we agreed to wait.
May of which year? 50?
Huh?
55.
5.
And how old were you?
I was 24.
4. Okay.
And I said,
How old was she?
22.
Okay.
And no, I was 23. She was 22. And so I went back, and we agreed to wait until July the 30th. That was our deal, and that's what we did. We got married on July the 30th, 1955.
Where?
At a preacher's house out in Inglewood. The pastor of Eastland Baptist Church, his name was Dr. Pinson. And we went over to his house and had the wedding at his house.
Maurice Pinson?
Huh?
Maurice Pinson? I know there's a Maurice Pinson. He was insurance, but
No, this guy's name was, I don't remember his first name. Dr. Pinson's all I knew.
and you've left us hanging because you came out of the military, you registered at one school, registered at another school, same day.
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, I got married, and I didn't see any way that I could quit my job. And by then, I had got a really good job at the newspaper.
What were you doing?
I was called what they call a suburban circulation manager.
Okay.
And that was I was in charge of the delivery of the newspaper, everything outside Davidson County. And I was making good money. And so I didn't see any way I could quit and go to law school. So
Are you still working for both papers at this time?
well, if you worked there, you had to work for both papers.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
It
that.
was the Newspaper Printing Corporation is who I worked for.
Okay.
And they were the business
Side.
agent for both newspapers.
Ac-
And so we started life, and then in about October, my wife developed a kidney problem, which turned out to be my daughter.
Oh, that's a strange kidney problem.
Yeah. So my daughter was born a year and a day after we were married. And I tell everybody that back then I did, that my daughter was born the day after we were married, but it was a year and a day. And I don't know if you know my daughter or not, Tina, but she's married to a lawyer in Dallas. And then I went along, and I kind of had law school in the back of my mind. And then in 1958, Mr. E.B. Stallman, who was the owner, publisher and owner's brother, had been doing all the labor relations work at the newspaper. And he was listed, I think, maybe as production manager or something. And he had a varicose vein operation. So but by that time, I was the director of circulation, which was in charge of everything for
Right.
the distribution of the newspaper. And they came down and said, you're going to have to negotiate the labor contracts. And I thought labor was having babies. I didn't know what they were talking about. So I said, well, fine. And I called Vanderbilt Law School, and I said, I want to come out there and brief a labor course, audit a labor course. And they said, okay, fine. So on the same day, ironically, I had scheduled a luncheon with Frank King, who was practicing law in town.
How did you know him?
Frank and I knew each other from a long time. I went to school. His younger brother, Billy, was in my school class, and we were very, very good friends
In high school?
in high school. And
Okay.
Frank got out of the service. He was in World War II, and he got out of the service and came back in 46 or 7, and I got to know him then, and we were really good friends. And when I started to college, I had a car, and Frank was in law school, so he would ride to school with me every day. And of course, I'd have to leave and go carry papers. He'd get home best way he could. But he'd go to law school, and I was an undergraduate. And I went to have lunch with him. And I said, I told him what was going on, and I was going to do this, and I'd called out there at Vanderbilt. And Frank went to Vanderbilt Law School. And he said, Bob, I wouldn't do that. If I was you, I'd register and go to the night law school. He said, you do that, you won't be wasting your time, and if you finish, you can practice law. So I went back to the office that same afternoon, and I called Chris Hoff, who was the secretary and treasurer of the night law school. And the school had been going on about a week when I called. He said, well, you'll have a little catching up to do, but yeah, you can come on, go. And he told me what all I needed, the credentials. And I went and I did that.
Now, was that at the...
That was the OY.
At the YMCA down on
Yes,
Church Street,
that's right?
Okay.
And I was in a class with really...
That's really close to where you're, because it's right across the bridge from the newspaper.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
No, the Y wasn't there then. The Y was on 7th Avenue then.
Oh.
It was on 7th Avenue, and it was not ideal classroom for it, but we made it. And I was in the class with really, really good people you know.
Who would that
Seth
be?
Norman,
Seth?
Jack Butler,
Ooh.
and they were all in the class. I mean,
Classmates.
Bill Rutherford. All good students, good things. And one thing, of course, I think we got things on the right path at the night law school now with Bill Koch out there.
Right.
But people just could not appreciate the education we got. It was terrific. And I know people don't really appreciate it because look at what we produced.
Right.
I mean, Jack, Seth, Bill Rutherford, I can name
Jack
the other.
Butler.
Jack, all of them. They're really good lawyers. And the teachers that taught us, I don't think they paid them much, but they were really dedicated to it. I never will forget, you ever remember Charlie Costner?
Yes.
Did bankruptcy. He taught bankruptcy. And you know, I don't know other people, but I know people that have gone to other schools, and they get out. Charlie Costner was a practitioner in bankruptcy. And after he would teach every night, we'd go outside, and Charlie would sit around and talk about it. When I got out of law school, I felt as qualified to represent somebody in bankruptcy as anybody could be. Because he would tell you the whole story, everything.
You knew everything you needed to know.
And the same thing was true with Raymond Leathers, criminal court judge, well respected, also a graduate of the school. And Raymond was a social friend of mine. He and Ella May and my wife, Jack Butler, we go and do things together. And when I got out of law school, before I got out, I told Raymond, I said, you're going to have to point me to some cases.
Well, you left us hanging. Before you started law school, you were going to do a labor contract.
Yeah.
And the fellow had some surgery.
Yeah.
So did you do that contract?
Oh, I did them all. I negotiated all the labor contracts for the newspaper.
And you work your way through law school, working at the newspaper.
Yeah.
And you're head of circulation.
Yeah.
And doing all those labor contracts. Yeah. Then you graduate from law school. And what happened after you graduated from law school?
Well, you know, now and this is kind of a sore point with me. People go to law school, and they don't go to practice law. They go to get a job. Yeah. And it may have been the law school I went to. It may be the instructors I had. But when I went to law school, nobody ever mentioned getting a job. I can remember being told, if you got a license to practice law, you got a job. You don't have to get a job. And that's what I did. There's never any doubt who I was going to practice with. I was going to practice with Frank. And we...
So somehow, while you were in law school, the idea that you would always work for the newspaper company kind of morphed into you knew you were going to practice with Frank King.
Yes.
And where do you think that transition occurred? Was it when you were talking to Frank and he said, go to law school and then you can come work with me?
Well, it just, he was in with Eugene Jackson, and it was Jackson, Tanner, Reynolds, and King. And I had a key to the office. I did all my studying in their office. It was just accepted that we would, when we got out, I was going to join
And
Frank.
you kind of in your own mind made up that decision too.
Yeah, and that was the way it was going to be. Never was any consideration that I would do anything but practice law with
So
Frank.
when you graduated, did you and Frank immediately start practicing together?
Absolutely. In fact, I got licensed on September the 7th, 1963, and that day I went over to the General Sessions Court with Frank, and his brother Billy, who was a pedodontist, had a little fender bender out here on Charlotte, and I walked up, and Alan Cornelius was the General Sessions judge, and Frank gave me no warning or nothing, and he said, he introduced me to the court and said, Mr. Ballow will try this case. And I tried my first case on the afternoon of September the 7th, 1963, with Billy King. Yeah.
Now that's maybe your first client or your first case. How did you build your practice? What did you do when you first started?
Well, I started like everybody started. Raymond Leathers appointed me on cases, and you know, I'd get in the office at 4 o'clock in the morning because I was like, oh, I didn't, you know, I think I had a better because I went to the Nashville School of Law, the YMCA Night Law School. I think I had a better understanding than people that got out of Vanderbilt, but still, you know, you got to learn to practice law after you get out of law school. And I had those things, and then I've been practicing law about a year, and there was a lawyer in Atlanta named Earl Phillips and Fisher. And while I was in law school, Earl was an excellent labor lawyer. He had a case in the press room in the Atlanta newspapers on manning, which meant how many men it took to man the press.
Okay.
And I knew the people at the Atlanta newspapers, and they said, you need to call Bob Ballow, because I'd been doing all negotiating at the Nashville newspapers. So he called me, and as I said, I was in law school, and he asked me to help him with it. So I went down and we tried this arbitration case together. And I wrote all the briefs and everything, and it was, we were very successful. And Earl sent me 2 white shirts, and he charged the Atlanta newspaper $20,000. And I thought, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this. But anyway, that's kind of the way I got it introduced. And then after that, I came back, and my first real client in the newspaper business, I had a guy who was Claude Capers, who was running the Southern Newspaper Publishers Association, called me one day, and he said, Bob, the pressmen have organized paper in Monroe, Louisiana. and I've recommended that he employ you to do it. The guy called me on the phone. His name was Jack Campbell, was the publisher. He called me on the telephone and wanted to employ me, and he did. And I went down and represented him in the Pressman situation. And he also, the people
Was that
don't,
negotiating a contract?
Huh?
Was that negotiating a contract?
well, it was everything. I mean, it was all kinds of unfair labor practice charges and negotiating the labor contract and all. But you will appreciate this. They put in 1964, they put in the Civil Rights Act, and my client, Jack Campbell, got a letter one day from the EEOC in New Orleans, and they were charging him with discriminating against 27 women who worked in the composing room as typesetters. And Jack didn't know what the EEOC was. So he responded to the letter without talking to me. And he wrote a letter back. He admitted everything. He said, they make about 40% of what the men make, and they do the same work. But he said every one of those women is married to a man with a good job, and they don't need any more money. And when he called me and read me the letter, I thought he was joking. I said, you didn't really send it? He said, yeah. I said, Jack, don't tell me you sent that letter. He said, I sent it, Bob. And said, now I got a letter from the director of the EEOC in New Orleans, and he wants us to come down there for a meeting. And I said, well, okay, this is not good, Jack. And so I went down there.
Now, you've been a lawyer for about a year?
No, a little longer than that. This went on for a couple of years.
Okay.
And
Because I thought you said it was, you graduated in 63, and 64 is when you got this.
64 is when they passed the Civil Rights Act.
Okay.
And this happened sometime after
Oh, okay.
that.
I was
And
wrong.
people were getting into it, but it was a comedy of errors. I didn't, it was new to me. But the good Lord just kind of takes care of people sometimes that don't know what they're doing. But I went down to New Orleans to meet with this fellow. I took my client with me, and he walked out. The guy that was running the place had been an All-American football player for Tulane. Really nice guy. He walked out and said, Mr. Blue, could I see you without your client? Yeah. I went in his office. He said, have you seen this letter? I said, yeah. He said, well, let's get this worked out, and don't worry about the letter. He said, I know he wasn't being represented by you at the time, and he didn't. And said, let's just work this out. And I said, okay. So I went back out. We couldn't work it out because the union guy, the business agent, had instigated it all, and he was using that to try to get something in labor relations. So he just was different, and it went on, of course, as you can imagine, 2 or 3 years. And the practice of law in New Orleans is a little different.
A lot different.
Than it is here. So I had a local counsel who was really a great local counsel. George, I can't think of his last name now, but he was terrific. In fact, while we were doing this, he was offered a job to teach at Harvard. And when you don't know what you're doing, you got to do something. A lawyer by the name of Katz in Monroe, Louisiana, filed a lawsuit. And we decided to make a pleading and ask for a more definite statement. So we filed this pleading asking for a more definite statement, and the judge granted it. And the lawyer on the other side, who's named Katz, he called me up and he said, what does this mean? I said, it means you got to make a more definite statement. He said, what else can I say? I said, I don't know. But the judge says, you got to make a more definite statement. And he said, well, I don't know how to do that. And I said, well, make a motion and ask the judge what it is he wants. I don't know. So he went round and round, and we got through all that. And I knew these 27 women were really creating a problem for him. And as they say, literally on the courthouse, we got ready to try the case, and on the courthouse steps, he came up, and I knew he wasn't prepared. He came up and he said, how much money will your client pay? I said, very little. And he said, will they pay $25,000? I said, no. And he said, well, how much will they pay? And I went back and talked to him. I said, let's offer him $10,000. We offered him $10,000. He came back and he said, look, I got this one lady who's bought all this carpet for our house, and she needs us money for that, and this one said, will he pay $13,000? I said, I don't know, I'll go ask him. I went, and we settled the case for $13,000, which, I mean, it's unbelievable. But the fortunate thing there was that the lawyer it was new, he didn't know, well, and we didn't know any more ourselves, really. I think we knew more than he did, but we didn't know any more.
Was this about 67, 68?
Yeah.
Okay, so when you start practicing with Frank and you're taking appointments right in the beginning of your career, you have the relationship with the lawyer down in Atlanta, because that happened while you were in law school.
Yeah.
And how did you build your business? This case down in Louisiana means you're traveling some.
Yeah, well, that was a really disadvantage. I had a fellow by the name of Dick Brown, whose family owned papers in Austin, Texas, Lubbock, Texas, 3 or 4 Texas towns. They owned the papers, Port Arthur, Texas, and he came over and watched me try the case in Monroe, Louisiana. Mm-hmm. And from that, he employed me to represent those papers in Texas. And from then on, it just, it just built to the point where in 2008.
Now you're taking a big jump here from 1968 to 2008.
Well, in 2008, we had built our practice to, we represented 329 daily newspapers. We represented all the big ones, did work for all the big ones. We represented the Tribune Company, we represented Cap Cities ABC, and we did work. Of course, newspapers, a lot of newspapers own television stations. So we got into representing television stations, and we got into representing radio stations. Oh. And at one time, the firm had 65 lawyers.
That's quite a few. So let me back up. We know that you got married, had a daughter a year and a day.
And a son.
When did that happen?
My daughter was born July the 31st, 1956. Brent was born October the 15th, 1958.
Okay. And in 58, you had not finished law school.
No.
So you're supporting a family. You're building your practice. You go in with Frank King. About 68, you have this Louisiana case. How many people were in the firm at that time? Because it sounds like shortly after that, the Texas fellow hires you. You couldn't be doing it all yourself.
There was probably 8 or 10 in the firm at that time.
So you're hiring other lawyers.
Yeah. Well, Frank and I really, we would have been satisfied just the two of us.
Now, what did Frank do? Did he help?
Frank had a very, very strong general practice.
Okay.
He did it all. Divorces, criminal. Back then people did that.
He just did everything.
Everything. And if you had $50, you had a lawyer and find out what your problem is.
How well did you do that first year with Frank?
The first year, I did real well. When I left the newspaper, I was, as far as I knew, I was the highest paid employee there. I made $40,000 a year in 1963. And when I went in to resign my position, Mr. James G. Stallman, who was the owner of the Nashville Banner, the afternoon newspaper, and the publisher, when I went in to resign, he told me I better think about it. He said, because if you stay in the newspaper business, you're going to amount to something. And if you quit and go down there and practice law, nobody's going to ever hear from you again. And he offered me a severance treatment by a psychiatrist. I can't think of that psychiatrist's name, but he was well known in Nashville. And he said, you go out and see him and tell him to send me the bill. I said, well, I don't think I'll do that, but I appreciate the offer. But my experience in the newspaper was good. And I made, in 1963, I quit a job making $40,000 a year. And today you tell somebody that, they don't think much about it, but that was a lot of money back then.
Yeah.
That was more than the senators made, and it was more than the president of banks made. And I started practicing law. And Eamon Evans told me, when I told him, he said, well, you'll end up making twice as much money as you make here.
Now, Eamon was the owner, publisher, or
Well, he was the publisher. Back then,
of
his
the,
mother, I guess, would be classified as the owner. His brother Silman had died. And he was right. First year I practiced law. I've got the ledger downstairs, but Frank and I split 50-50. I made $77,000 plus a few dollars. And when Frank and I started practicing law, we didn't, you know, we just were going to practice law. And after a couple of 3 weeks, I said, you know, Frank, we ought to get some understanding about, you know, if we're going to have a law firm. And he said, well, yeah, fine. What do you want to do? I said, well, I think we ought to talk about how we're going to split the money.
right.
He said, it's 50-50. That's the way we'll do it. And Frank had an established practice. He'd been, I guess Frank had been practicing law then 10, 11 years.
Ooh.
And
That was pretty nice for you.
and he said, and we kept it that way the whole time.
When you first started practicing, was there any agreement or understanding that you might be representing the Newspaper Printing Corporation?
No, I never did represent Newspaper Printing Corporation.
Oh,
I never represented this paper locally. Never did. They would call me once in a while, but
they weren't
about
your,
something, but
they
yeah,
weren't your.
never did. No.
So all of the business that you built had to do with newspaper owners that were in other states and other
Yeah.
areas?
Well, Chancellor, the good thing about what I did, when I was at the newspaper, they were really good to me. I mean, I always laughed and said I never had a boss. And that's really pretty true. And as I was going up through the rank, they let me go to every kind of meeting there was. And I was the youngest president of the Southern Circulation Managers Association. And I knew all the people in the newspaper, but knew everywhere. And so I guess that started when before I was the manager of circulation. That was probably right after I got out of the Navy. I started going and meeting these people and getting to know them, and they appointed me to committees, and you know, just like you do with all those things. And so I got to know all the people in the newspaper business. Right. And I had a lot of encouragement from these people to resign and practice law. And I always knew when I did that, if I didn't make it practicing law, I could always get a job in the newspaper business. So that was a little bit of a comfort.
So as you are building your practice, you're beginning to travel
Yeah.
more outside of Tennessee than one would think
Yeah.
for somebody with real deep roots here.
Yeah.
How did your wife deal with you being gone so much?
Well, I tell you, I married the only human being alive that could do that. I married a very special, my wife was extremely special human being. And the way I handled it was, after the kids got up a pretty good age, I called every night, never missed a night, and if I was going to be out of town on a weekend, she flew wherever I was, every weekend. In fact, when we handled the New York Daily News case back in 88, 89, 90, I was in New York for 2.5 years. And the client was a fellow by the name of Charlie Brumbeck. He ran the Tribune Company. He called me one day and he said, "Bob, what would it take to get you to spend weekends in New York?" I said, "Well, Charlie, I need to go home sometime." He said, "Well, let me tell you what we'll do. We'll pay for Betty to fly to New York every week, round trip every week. We'll buy a round trip ticket. And while she's there, we'll pick up all your expenses, food, you know, shows, anything you want to do." And they had me in a very, very nice apartment in New York at the corner of 48th and First, right across from the UN building.
Ooh.
And I said, "Well, let me talk to her and see." So I called her and she said, "Man, that sounds good to me." So she flew up every Thursday morning and flew home every Monday for 2.5 years.
Wow.
And we did it all. In fact, the last Saturday night we were there, we had seen all the movies, we'd seen all the plays a couple of times, and we had to go to Blockbusters and rent a movie. And she said, "When you're in New York and you got to go to Blockbusters and rent a movie, it's time to go home."
Now,
And
Blockbuster doesn't exist, so for people who watch this in the years to come, Blockbusters was a place you could rent movies and
you could
watch them at
rent
home.
movies. Blockbusters was the predominant place where you could go and rent movies. So we'd go rent a movie and watch it. But we saw Phantom of Opera, you know, a couple of times, and we saw every play in New York.
Well, let me ask you this. I don't have a chronology on this, but let me ask you about this lawsuit. Tell us what was significant about that lawsuit and why you had to spend 2.5 years of your life in New York City.
Well, it was a strike, and we were battling all the 5 crime families in New York.
This is the Tribune. The Tribune,
The New York Daily News.
New York Daily News. Okay.
And
you're battling the crime families?
well, I mean, they were all involved in the unions, and the unions all represented the unions there. And they, you know, it's just a really, really big mess.
You mean people who might have criminal associations were involved in these unions?
Oh, good Lord, yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
see, I don't know all this.
Well,
and people listening
they
probably
would come. They were funny people, and ironically enough, they were criminal. But I liked them. They were funny. They would come to the bargaining table, and they'd have some ridiculous proposal, and they say, "Now, John told us to bring this," referring to John Gotti.
Oh.
John told us, and then if you gave them a proposal, they'd
Now,
look at it and
he's
say,
the head of the mafia, John Gotti.
"Yeah."
So
But
he
they would, I think, cutting up. I mean, but and I would give them a proposal. They said, "No, John ain't gonna go for this." But they were clowns and cut-ups, and you know, to be honest, it really wasn't all their fault. I mean, the management of the newspaper had been so weak and given in to them for so many years. I'll tell you a good story. I went to the bargaining table one day with the drivers union. And I said, they had a guy named Mike Alvino. And Mike was an interesting guy in himself. He was the president of the union at that time.
This is the drivers' union.
Yeah.
And they're the ones that drop the papers off
Yeah.
and deliver them everywhere?
Everywhere. And Mike, we tried to, I had a local counsel there named Henry Cohen. And Henry had been an assistant U.S. attorney. And we had a lawsuit, and he wouldn't work with me because we basically were defending Mike in something, and he had prosecuted Mike's predecessor and put him in the penitentiary for stealing money, and Mike had been very untruthful on the stand and all, so he wouldn't represent us. He said, no, I ain't gonna fool with that guy. So Mike was an interesting guy, and one day I went into the negotiations, and I had just taken a piece of yellow paper and figured out the waste we were having and all, and I said, Mike, I figured that you were stealing $16 million a year out of that mailroom. He said, that is ridiculous. I said, well, I can show you my numbers. They may be wrong because I just did this sitting out there in the room, but we're missing a lot of papers. He said, that's so ridiculous that I never heard of anything like it. So I left New York in April, and I came back to Nashville, and in August, on the 31st of July, 1990, I guess, 92, I had a total hip replacement on a Friday. And I was in the hospital, and on Saturday morning the phone rang. It was Mike Alvino. And he said, Bob, I didn't know you needed a hip, sir. I said, yeah, I heard it playing high school football. I needed hip surgery. And he said, well, I want to tell you, we really enjoyed having you in New York. He said, I count that among the greatest experiences I've ever had. And he said, everything you ever said at that bargaining table was true, except one thing. I said, is that right? I said, what did I say that was untrue? He said, you came in there one day and said we were stealing $16 million worth of papers. I said, yeah. He said, you weren't even close. I said, is that right? He said, no, we went outside and laughed about it. Said you wasn't even close. I said, well, I just did the best I could.
So tell me the outcome of this case. You have these unions that are striking. The paper's not publishing, right? They're not getting their papers delivered?
We put papers out every day.
Oh, you did?
All put it out every day, but
You
we
had-
could not, the violence was terrific. And we couldn't control the violence. So a guy named, I forgot his name. Well, anyway, he came along. He was an Englishman, and Robert Maxwell came along, and you may remember that. He was a very, very interesting fellow. He came along, and the Tribune Company had, by conservative estimates, about $450 million in liability for lifetime jobs. And he bought the paper. We gave him $60 million to take the paper. And he took it. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, this is ridiculous.
Liability.
Huh?
He took the liability, too.
Yeah, and I couldn't believe it. But anyway, we got it all done. Everybody approved. I never will forget, I was in Boston, and I had been telling Charlie Brumbeck, who was the chairman of the board, or CEO of the Tribune Company, that he'll never go through with it. Lawyers won't let him go through with it. And he called me. I would tell him maybe 2 or three, maybe 2 or 3. He'd say, what are the chances you think this will go through? I said, none, they won't go through. And he said, the night, on a scale of 1 to 10, they were getting ready to close the deal in April of 91 or 92. And he called me on the phone, and I was at Copley Center, and I was going to make a speech the next day to the Inland Press Association. And he said, well, they're all in a room, they're getting ready to sign. What do you think the chances are now? I said, I'll never forget it. I said, Charlie, there's something we don't know. But I would say the chances are 3 out of 10. I said, there's something we don't know. And I don't know what it is. But you'd have to be an idiot to make this deal. He said, well, he wants the $60 million. I said, yeah, but look what he's picking up in liability. So they closed the deal, and he bought it. And about 3 or 4 months after that, one morning I got up, and I was at the O'Hare Airport, and Gene Bell, who was the production manager at, a very dear friend of mine, production manager at the Tribune at the time. Later, he became the publisher of the newspaper in San Diego. And the daughter is Deanna Williams, judge down in.
Oh, yes, I do know.
And Gene called me on the phone and said, Bob, I got some news for you. I said, what is it? He said, your buddy Robert Maxwell was found in the Mediterranean Ocean this morning, floating upside down naked. And I said he committed suicide. He said he did not commit suicide. I said, that's not, something's wrong, it didn't commit suicide. Well, to get ahead of myself a little bit, it came out later, and there were many better books written about it, that the Mosaic, the Jewish organization, they think murdered him because he was operating with the KGB in Russia and with the Mosaic in Israel, and he was playing each against each other, and allegedly had told the Mosaic they had to give him $400 million, or he was going to tell the Russians something. And so they decided it was cheaper to kill him, in my opinion, than it was to give him the $400 million. But after that, they found out, and we found out, he had stolen $2 billion from the pension funds he had in England. And his wife didn't go to a penitentiary. One of his sons went to the penitentiary, and one of them did something else, but he had stolen all this money. And the reason he bought the New York Daily News was that he wanted to get his hands on that pension money that they had. And he thought what was really funny about it was the guy that was handling the pension fund for the Daily News, as soon as Maxwell bought it, he sent the guy and his wife to Europe for 6 weeks, all expenses paid, to go around and do that. And when he got back, he approached the guy about transferring the money, and the guy said no. After he'd sent him to Europe and done it, he said no. So Maxwell decided he had Chancellor, he had the finest boat that I'd ever been on, and he parked it in the North River up in at the Water Club in New York. And it was absolutely, he bought, the boat was half built for an arms dealer in Israel or something. And that guy got put in jail, arrested, and he took over that boat. And I would go over and visit him on the boat. And I told him, when they said he got killed, I said, did he leave me the boat? I was interested in the boat. And they said, no, he didn't leave you the boat, but said, I'll tell you what, somebody, I forget who bought the boat, somebody bought the boat, but he offered me, the boat was in New York, and he was sending it somewhere overseas, and he had 18 crew on it, and they were all young college students. And he told me to get Betty, and you can take the boat for 2 weeks and go over there, but you'll have to fly home. And I never told my wife about it because I figured she'd want to do that. But he was just a real crook.
Let me interrupt for just a second. We're going to pause for a minute. Bob, we took a small break, and upon reflection, there were one or two things you wanted to say.
All right. Well, you reminded me that I said I didn't play high school sports, and that basically is true. But I did get, when I was a freshman in high school, we were playing one day football, and a fellow by the name of Gordon Potter threw a big block onto me, and when I came down, I hit on my rear end. And I developed, from that, I had a thing called an impacted femur. And that's why 46 years later, I had to have hip surgery. And my wife used to say, he doesn't put things on, it's only been 46 years. But I didn't want to have any hip surgery. The other thing I wanted to kind of straighten out, because the dates might not be a job, but I started the law school in 1958. And I was with those people, but I only went until the first of the year, and then I got an appointment at Columbia University to go there for several months and study newspapers and stuff. And then I had to drop out of school, and then I came back in '59 and picked up where I had left off in '58. So I was actually in 2 different classes.
I see. So even though the Nashville School of Law would typically be a 4-year evening program,
Yeah, that's right.
You went to Columbia
Yeah, Columbia
for
University.
6 months or so?
No, about 3 months.
3 months. And that was, of course, having to do with your day job,
Yeah, with newspapers.
the
yeah.
newspaper, so you were really out of town again.
Yep.
And now here's your wife with these little kids, and you're traveling probably for the first time. That was probably the first big trip you took out of town.
Yeah, I'd be out of town, yeah.
Then we zoomed forward to this big case, because I really wanted to hear about that, but I want to take you back now to where you and Frank are building your practice.
Yeah.
You are getting the clients in Georgia, Texas,
Everywhere,
Louisiana,
yeah.
all around.
Yeah.
And you are traveling quite a bit. How is the law firm developing, say, in the first 10 years?
Well, to tell you the truth, we could have done a lot better. But Frank and I never wanted to relinquish control. And I would interview people, and they would, if I was in Dallas, Texas, they would come to Dallas, Texas. We'd pay for them to come there, and I'd interview them. And we probably employed people that normally wouldn't, but we had the business, and we had to get help and do the best we could. And I think, considering the way we did it, we probably didn't do too bad. We probably could have done better, but we just developed a practice back in that day. We didn't hire anybody unless they had clerked for a federal judge, and that eliminated a lot of people.
And was that because most of what you did ended up being in federal court?
No, that was a good reason, but it had to do with maturity. In our practice, we didn't, we weren't practicing in one office in Nashville where if a lawyer had a problem, he could come back to the office and we could talk about it. And so we had to hire people with a little more maturity, and they had to go out on their own and have a little confidence. I'd take them on a couple of trips with me, and then and a lot of, you get young people right out of law school, they just didn't have the maturity to do it. But if we had somebody that clerked for a federal judge for 2 years, they had a little more maturity.
More experience.
They had a little bit more understanding of what was going on. And so we did that. And if we hired anybody else other than a clerk back then, we hired them for a year on a contract. And if they worked out fine, if they didn't, fine. But most of the people we hired, we still have people here who've been here 35, 40 years. They're clerks for federal judges.
It's good history. While you were building your practice, did you get involved in either the state or the local bars?
No, I was gone all the time.
Too much.
And back before I started traveling so much, Joe Henry was up at the state, and I was the public relations person for the Tennessee bar, and every year we'd have something where the governor would give an award or do something, and I'd set that up, and I did that because I had contacts with the newspaper.
Now, that leads us into another kind of area, and I know that you mentioned Joe Henry, but he eventually was on the Tennessee Supreme Court,
Yes.
Justice Henry, and you met him before he was a judge.
Oh, yeah.
He was up in the legislature.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, and even maybe before that.
So how and what involvement did you have with politics?
I was never involved in politics, really. The only time I ever got involved was when Dave Pack was going to run for governor. I knew Dave.
And he was the former Attorney General?
At the time he decided he was the Attorney General. And Dave had good credentials, and I liked him. And he called me one day and said, "Bob, I want you to be co-chairman of my campaign to run for governor." And I said, "You know, Dave, I don't know anything about politics." He said, "Yeah, but you've been the director of circulation for the Nashville newspapers, and I'm told that in every county, you know everybody in every county in Middle Tennessee." And I said, "Well, that's probably an exaggeration, but I do know a lot of people because I traveled those counties for the newspaper." And he said, "Well, I want you to do it." So we talked a few times, and I said, "Well, I'll help you. I'll do whatever I do." And he had a fellow up there that was working at the Attorney General's office named Dick something.
Lodge? No.
Dick who?
Lodge? No.
No, that's a long time for Dick Lodge. He owned a radio station in Lexington, Tennessee. Dick Baird or Dick something. And we were going to work together. And we met up in Dave Pack's office, and a guy named Noble Caudell and a guy named Walters from Knoxville that owned the thing, and who had been named a senator for a short time, Hub Walters.
And he owned a radio station?
No, Dick Baird, the guy he owned the radio station.
Okay.
Hub Walters owned that trailer outfit up there. And
Okay.
he built
Modular
houses,
home.
yeah.
Modular.
And we met in Dave's office, and he and Hub Walters were really, really close. And Noble Caudell was kind of going to be the treasurer of this deal. And I'd agreed to help Dave run, and we met, and Dave, I never will forget it, he said something about what all had to be done, and he said, "We got to get the money." And Hub Walters said, "Do not worry about the money. You'll have all the money you need and more. Don't worry, just make up your mind you want to do this." And it sounded pretty good. And I thought, well, he get all the money he needs, it's going to be a pretty good day. And about 3 weeks later, Hub Walters died. And Dave Pack, we couldn't get any money, nobody. Everybody, he sent me to places to get money, and when I'd get there, they wanted me to give them money. And we got some kind of misunderstanding here. But I think Dave finished 8th in that race because he didn't have it. He had no money at all.
Was that the race where Blanton got elected?
It was the race where Blanton got elected.
Ooh. Well, because you're traveling so much and you're not involved in politics, you really are involved in the practice of law in a variety of venues, whether it's arbitration or the courts or whatever. And your practice, the firms are growing with this unusual setup with the lawyers in the various states. As you said, you had to find them where they were, and
Yeah.
you had to employ them where they were, so to speak. What did you notice about the way in which, over those 10, 20 years, that things changed? Because communications changed. We didn't talk about radio stations or anything like that. But how did you observe, this is very unusual and probably ahead of its time, type of law firm, because we now have mega law firms that have offices in all these different places, but you are establishing a law firm with a lawyer or two in various spots.
Yeah.
Not necessarily opening up an office.
That's right.
But you have these
Yeah.
relationships
Yeah.
with them, contractual or otherwise. What have you seen as far as the change in the practice of law over the last 20, 30 years?
Well, I think I mentioned this earlier. If I didn't, I'll mention it now. Over a period of years, it got to the point where people didn't want to practice law. They didn't want to go to court. They wanted a job. And, you know, we had one lawyer here several years ago, and we sent him to California to take some depositions. And when he got back, he resigned. And he said, I said, well, what's the matter? He said, I just can't do it. He said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to take depositions. I don't want to go to court. And I think he was being honest because I felt a lot of them were that way. They didn't, it was the thing where, well, you know yourself, because I know you practiced law at the time. If somebody came in and you had never done this before, you got in the books and figured it out.
Right.
Now, I mean, right today, if you go to some of the lawyers here and say, they say, oh, I don't do that. I don't do that kind of. They wanted a job, and they didn't want to work as hard as we had to work to build a law firm. And a lot of people, you know, not many people can be rainmakers. And I understand that. That has to do with personality. But you don't always have to be doing something overtly with people to be a rainmaker. You can get a client. Woody Sims, you know, Woody with Bass, Perry and Sims told me one time, all you need to build a law practice is one good client.
That's right.
And I think that's very true. And I think that's really the way we built the firm. You do a good job, and they'll tell somebody. And you've got to have a personality where you have a willingness and a desire to serve people and to inconvenience yourself, to give service. We would employ lawyers, and they didn't want to put their home telephone number on their business card because they didn't want anybody bothering them at home. Man, when I started practicing law, people could bother me anytime, day or night. I was ready to go. And it's just not that way now. And as a young fellow, just graduated from Vanderbilt Law School last year, and the son of a friend of mine, and I advised him. He said what to do, and I told him, get a job clerking for a federal judge, and practice law. That really and truly, that's where the fun is. That's where the excitement and the action is, practicing law. And the fact that you get knocked down once in a while is not important. It's how fast you get up every time.
And that you get up.
And you know, I'll tell you something. Now, you may not remember old Judge Gray here in town,
Yes,
federal judge.
I do.
I loved old Judge Gray. Judge Gray, he would eat you out blood raw. But he appointed me one time to represent a crazy man, and my man was crazy. And Joe Brown, who's U.S. Magistrate down there now, still, he was the lawyer, he represented the government, and he still hates my man. But Judge Gray appointed me to represent that fellow, and it went on for 13 months. And we had about 2 hearings a week for 13 months. And my man just, he was absolutely nuts, but wouldn't anybody believe it. But I brought in plenty of psychiatric proof that he was. But because I worked really hard in that case, Judge Gray had a very good feeling toward me, but you'd never know it because he would eat me out and he'd eat everybody out. Chancellor Irvin Gilcrease, who became a chancellor over here, and you know, the worst I ever heard any human being eat out in my life was Judge Gray ate him out one day when he was an assistant U.S. attorney for not filling out a summons right. It was in blood. I just hung my head. He ate everybody out. But I had an experience with him one time, and I won't call names, but there was an assistant U.S. attorney called me and said, Bob, there are 3 guys in here from Washington for the food and drug people, and they're going to close down these grocery stores, the CB grocery stores that you represent, because they say the warehouse is dirty and needs to be cleaned up. And said they're going in to see Judge Gray ex parte. I said, I'll be there. So I went down, sat down, and they were all sitting outside Judge's office. And I sat down with them, spoke to the secretary, and I knew. And in a minute, Judge Gray came and he said, you fellows come on in. And they all, every one of those fellows had an enormous beard. And Judge Gray was a little bitty fellow from down in Franklin, Tennessee. He called us back in there. And he asked those fellows, he said, okay, what have you got here? So they told him about the horrors of our warehouse, what was bad, and went through the whole story and everything. And they didn't know who I was. They thought I was a clerk or something. So he turned to me and he said, okay, Mr. Ballow said, what do you got to say? And I said, well, and they indicated they won't know who I was. And he said, you don't know Mr. Ballow? And they said, no. And he said, well, which I thought was a great line. He said, well, I don't know how long you fellows are going to be in town, but I hope you brought your shaving gear. And I don't know that they ever got it. But I thought they all had enormous beards. And he said, well, it's unfortunate that you got Mr. Ballow. He said, you're going to be here a long time. Because we had just finished this crazy man case, went on for 13 months. And Judge Gray would come in, and he said, and they thought that he was being critical of me, because he said, you get up in the morning, Mr. Ballow's there, and you go to bed at night, Mr. Ballow's there. Said everywhere you look, he's there, and it goes on and on and on. And they were just having a ball out of this. You know, they thought this, and he said, I'm sorry, you got Mr. Ballow. He said, it's not going to be pleasant. He went through, he turned to me and he said, what do you got to say? And I said, Judge, those fellows got in last night from Washington. They have not been out to the warehouse in 90 days. They have no earthly idea what condition the warehouse is in. And it's ridiculous for them to sit there and tell you. I said, it might be the cleanest warehouse in America. He turned to him and said, fellas, is that right? I said, yeah. He said, oh, no. We'll have a hearing on this. We ain't closing anything down. we'll have a hearing on it. And I know when those fellows left, they thought, golly, he was sitting there saying all those things about that lawyer, and then he agreed with him, you know. I know they must have been completely frustrated. And the lady that was an assistant U.S. attorney, she told me later, she said, that's the funniest thing. Said they came back in the office and said they were bewildered beyond words. They said, who? He said, he don't like that guy, does he? They said, we don't know. Well, Judge Gray just did that. You know, that was just his style. But I always knew. And after that, you know, I would walk in his court. He'd be trying a case. And he'd say, I'd just walk in. He'd say, Mr. Ballow, can we help you? And I said, no, sir, I'm just waiting on Mr. King or something. And then he would start with a jury impanel for another case. He'd say, well, Mr. Ballow and I tried a case here for 13 months. And I'll tell you another funny thing. One day, Judge Gray was talking to my client, and he said the whole thing, and my client said, look, Judge, we're wasting time. So why don't you just go ahead and hang me? I know that's what you're going to do. Just hang me and let's get it over with. And Judge Gray said, well, you're not charged with an offense that's punishable by death. So we're not going to hang you. So we're going to give you a fair trial. We're going to give you time to say your piece, and the court's going to give you a fair trial, and you can bet on that. And my client said, Judge, I know you want to do that. But he pointed in the back of him and he said, but those people up there won't let you. And Judge Gray turned around in his chair and he looked back and he said, well, those people don't have a lot to say about what I do.
Now, are these imaginary people?
Huh?
Are they imaginary?
Oh, they nobody. Yeah, they're imaginary people. And so we went back in chambers with Joe Brown, and Judge Gray said, I ain't going to put up with a lot of that. He said, I don't believe anything he says. And it said, he, you know, he's putting on an act. And I said, well, you know, Judge, when he said those people wouldn't let you, you turned around and looked. Judge Gray looked at me just as strong as he could, and he said, Mr. Ballow, I don't know how long you intend to practice law in the Middle District of Tennessee. But if you intend to practice law in the Middle of Tennessee, you better believe I did not turn around and look. I said, okay, Judge, have it your way. But I really liked Judge Gray. He was tough on, but I knew when he'd get on me that he was doing it for the benefit of other people. I know that day he had those 3 lawyers in there. There is no question in my mind. He did that on purpose so they'd think that, we weren't on good terms. But they found out they was wrong.
While you are going through your practice, things are happening in society like the Vietnam War. And we had the recession under Carter, and we had the Reagan years. Did any of these major events impact the way you practice law or the practice of law that you had? Did you have, you told me that you started off with newspapers and then radio stations. How did the practice evolve?
Well, they were all usually owned. In other words, when we represented Cap City's ABC, they owned newspapers, but they owned television stations. And probably, when you say, as the years evolved, the practice of labor law is very political. The labor board is picked, if the Democrats in power, it's 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And if the Republicans in, it's 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And you know, it changed overnight when they went into office. And you had to be prepared for that. And you had to practice law in such a way that the client had to understand that, you know, this is not something we can
Control.
do like you do in civil practice and depend on the law, because they'll change it. And sometimes you even with a Democrat in, you would get a reasonably good board, but not very often. And people would just, you know, you had to find lawyers who could go and take that rejection and understand that it's not me. I didn't fail at what I was trying to do. I had a difficult
Change the law.
political
Right.
situation, and you know, getting up to the current day, Donald Trump is he's changed all that in about he changed the whole complexion of the law in about 60 days.
That's right.
They went in and I mean, the labor board changed everything. It's a different practice now.
And I want to talk about the change in the practice, because it seems as though there has been a significant change in labor law. Unions used to be very, very strong and much bigger than they are now. And what you said about newspapers, people really don't have that many newspapers come into the house anymore. We don't have newspaper boys. How has the shift occurred? What do you see are the causes, and what do you see are the ramifications of those changes?
Well, it's different. You know, the truth is, and I represent it management exclusively, but I try to be objective. When unions got started in they started long before, but the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, people just didn't have as much education. And over a period of years, they have become educated. And that's weakened the unions, because, you know, people talk about Tennessee being a lot of non-union. They don't understand that when you go to Smithville, Tennessee, and try to organize a bunch of farmers, there's nobody more independent than a farmer. And you ain't gonna tell him how to do it. So they couldn't expand it really into the South, because people were just more independent. And the education, when I started practicing labor law, let's say it was in 1964 or 5, about 35 or 36% of the workforce was unionized. Today it might be 6.5%. But a good example of that, I think, I had a case in California. I won't mention any client's name, but I think they had 29 lawyers that were going to join the Teamsters Union.
The
And
lawyers were going to join the union?
Huh?
The lawyers were going
Yeah.
to join the union?
They worked for a company,
Oh.
and they were going to join the union, the Teamsters. And I got employed to represent them. And they said they had all the people that signed cards and all. And I went out there, and for the campaign, the way I conducted the campaign, the union would tell them something. For example, they said, well, if you don't like the union, you can get out. You can just sign and get out. Well, the way I conducted the campaign, I just cited cases, because they were all lawyers, and I'd say, read it, disproving what the union said. And when we had the election, the union got 1 vote. Because everything they told them was wrong. But if they went into a place, and the average, I had a client up in Pennsylvania, Strasburg, Pennsylvania, at Glen, Pennsylvania. And there was a young man in there, and his daddy had worked at this same company. And he was a high school graduate. And he said the reason he was joining the union was his daddy had told him it was illegal for the company to give him a raise unless he was in the union. Well, that you know, you would think, well, that's ridiculous.
But, you know, if they're raised with that and they believe that, that's the thing you're fighting. And you've got to go in, and over a period of years, people have gotten, you know, when I was coming along, I was the only person in my family ever graduated from high school. My mother, I'm sure, didn't go to the 8th grade. Nobody thought anything about quitting school in the 7th, 8th grade. And a lot of those people were in the workforce. And they didn't know when they were misrepresented, they didn't know that that wasn't true. So that has pretty well, education has pretty well done it to them.
And how has technology affected?
Well, technology has done a tremendous amount. When I was working at the newspaper in my earlier time, we had the hot type and the linotype machines.
What's a hot type?
Well, that's when you melt the lead and you make slugs that go in and put them into a form, and they're lead with a print on them, and that's what you make the plates out of that go on the press. Well, along came the cold type, which is where you
Key and
type like a typewriter, and I never will forget it. It was funny how it had developed, but when it first came along and did it, you typed what they called idiot tape. And what that meant was it wasn't divided into paragraphs, it wasn't divided into nothing. It was just straight type. And then they had a little thing like a phone booth, and they called that adjuster tape. And then you'd run that through, and it would put it all in types and paragraphs and all that, and the adjuster tape did. And then, of course, I'll tell you an interesting thing I had one time to show it, to demonstrate how it was. I will say it was in Brunswick, Georgia. The typographical union there, and they had a certain standard you had to meet in the contract, how many lines of type you had to set in a day, in an hour or shift, to be competent. And so we were negotiating a new contract for the cold type. And we were arguing about what it took to be competent. Well, I said, we were arguing about how much it was, and I said, well, you don't have, it's antiquated. Your people are working on machinery that is out of date. You can't apply the same thing. So we kind of agreed on a certain amount of stuff, and I said, I can go out here on the street and get somebody, and they can set more type than that. And they challenged me. A guy named Russ Watterson was the international rep. He challenged me. Now, I cheated a little bit, but I went up to a law office, and I got a legal secretary, and I gave her the book about this machinery and told her to study it. And I told her her assignment was to come down and to sit at this machine and set type through the thing. And she agreed to do it. So they all came in and sat down to watch this girl. And I don't know if you've ever watched tape go through a little thing, but she would type, and she would type so fast that the tape would arch. It wouldn't go down straight. It would just go up like that because she was typing so fast. And it was 10 or 15 times what they could do on the linotype machine. So it just changed everything. And we used to, when we had strikes later on, we could set up a newspaper in a couple of hotel rooms with the computers and put it all in it, and then we'd contract with somebody to print the newspaper. So it changed it dramatically in that newspapers could take strikes with no problems at all. Right. And that was a lot of leverage that we had. They used to, unions used to scream and holler, well, you're a strike breaker and all. But the truth is, technology just changed the leverage.
Right. Do you think newspapers will survive?
No. There'll be something happen, but there's no way. You cannot get the revenue in a newspaper that it takes to support the infrastructure of a newspaper. It's not there.
And how has the law firm transitioned with the advent of technology and the computers? Radio stations still exist. You still have those as clients, I would assume.
Yeah, we do now. I'm not really active in the firm
Right.
anymore. I'm resigned
Resigned to what?
4 years ago, but I still come to the office every day. But
And I wanted to ask you about your work habits.
Okay.
So we'll come back to that in a minute, but go ahead. You resigned and
at the end of 2000, in May 1st, 2014, I resigned from the firm. But I come to the office. Under contract, they have to give me an office and a secretary. And it's gone down. In other words, newspapers they have bigger problems now than labor unions.
yep.
And the labor
Survival.
unions don't have any leverage because, getting out. Now, a lot of major newspapers have gone to publishing 3 days a week. New Orleans, Birmingham, a lot of those have gone to the Newhouse papers. But newspapers cannot survive as they are. And I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I think there's going to be some changes in the law as to cross ownerships, where somebody can own a radio station, a television station, and a newspaper all in the same town. And if you've got enough revenue coming in, you can, you can afford to have the newspaper. And everybody, me for being one, they want to have a newspaper to read, and I do. But it's going to be a process, and I think there'll be some changes. The FCC will do that. Then there'll be people that'll come in, and they'll buy a radio station, they'll buy a newspaper, and they'll buy a television station, and operate it all out of the same.
How has the clientele for King and Ballow changed so that newspapers are no longer the focus? Radio stations, yes. What else constitutes the bulk of the practice for King and Ballow?
Doing a lot of intellectual property, music, business, intellectual property. During all of those years, we diversified out quite a bit. Right. And today, I think, Eddie Whalen does a lot of work in the trucking industry. And we still, of course, represent a number of newspapers. And but newspapers in such a situation where I know where there are newspapers that they'll be delighted to give you the newspaper if you'll take the pension liability.
Yeah.
And that goes on all the time.
So in the entertainment world, in the intellectual property area, do you have just not the entertainment area, but are there things like computer companies and codes and clients in that area?
Not really to that area, but they're more or less people who steal music from one another.
Right.
I don't think there was ever been but one song written, and everybody's been stealing off of it all these years, because every time I just happen maybe to read a pleading or something. I don't do any of that work, but we've diversified enough that the firm. Of course, the firm has been hit hard because of the newspaper business, but there's been a lot of business out there that in the last few years we didn't get because different generation of lawyers, and there've been a lot of transactional business that we didn't get. We got some, but that we didn't get because of it. So it's just transactional business where people are having to sell their newspapers, and we did some for clients that we represented over the years.
Right. Do you have lawyers who are actively engaged in trial litigation
Oh,
with
yeah,
the firm?
yeah,
Because as you said, there's a lot of transactional law that goes
yeah.
on.
Well,
Do you
yeah, we've got Richard Bush, who does our music stuff. He tries lawsuits all the time, yeah.
Do you still have relations or contract relations with lawyers in other cities now, as you did, say, in the 70s, 80s?
Not really.
So King and Ballow has kind of centralized right here in Nashville.
Yeah.
And how large is it right now?
You know, Chancellor, I think we probably got 23, 24, something like that, lawyers. That's about it.
That's pretty good. If you had to define the culture of King and Ballow, how would you describe it in comparison to the other law firms that you know in Nashville? Law firms develop their own personalities.
Well, I want to say this, that I hope this is true, and you're probably in a better position than I am to know, but you knew my law partner, Frank King.
Yes.
And Frank was a person that he didn't want anybody around him that wasn't honest. He didn't want anybody around him that couldn't tell the truth. And he put a more emphasis on hiring the right kind of people and having the right kind of people work here than he did what their resume might hold. And I hope over the years that the culture has been one that if you worked at King and Ballow, people would expect you to be the right kind of person, not only an adequate lawyer, but the right kind of person. And
I would agree. I think one of the characteristics of King and Ballow that I am aware of is how hardworking.
I think that's true. And you know, that worked good and bad. I know that we used to come every Saturday morning because we were out of town all week, and we'd have meetings on Saturday morning. And we had people that we employed that made good money, that they weren't going to work on Saturdays. And you know these things. I'm preaching to the choir, but I was in my office every Saturday morning at 7, and I stayed till about 4:30 or 5 in the evening, went home, got my wife, and we went out. And on Sunday after church, we'd go somewhere and eat brunch, and about 2 o'clock, we were in the office on Sunday. And not only me, all the lawyers were. Right. And we meet, I don't know if you're familiar with the Romeo Club or not.
Nope, don't know that club.
Well, the Romeo Club is a bunch of old lawyers. And Romeo stands for Retired Old Men Eating Out. And Doug Fisher is, I guess, the chairman of the board.
Who else are the members?
Well, Hayes Clooney is a member, and Ward DeWitt, and Dick Bird, and Don Smith, and John Waxter, and we meet once a month, the first Wednesday of every month out at the University Club. And we were talking a couple of meetings ago about that. I mean, on Saturdays, at lunch, everybody was in Zagers, eating lunch. It wasn't a, you didn't think anything about it. As things developed, you know, people come, they wasn't fixing to work on Saturdays. And more power to them, but you had to do it back then.
What do you think were some of the pitfalls that you had in practicing law?
Well, I think I've been very, very fortunate. I think about it a lot, and I can't think of any. To me, it was always a very exciting and rewarding way to make a living. And it was so good to me, and I made such a good living, that I guess it caused me to be a little negligent of my home life. But that's why I was fortunate, because I married a woman who really, really liked. Somebody asked her one time, said, don't you object to Bob working all the time? She said, not as long as he brings the money home. And, and she never complained one time about my being gone. Well, you know, usually she enjoyed, like if I was going to be out of town in San Francisco on a weekend, she would fly out there, and we'd have a nice weekend in San Francisco. And I just, you know, I really never thought of it. And too, you know this too. Back then, you knew all the judges, and I described Judge Gray to you, but I love to be in his courtroom. I love to be in his courtroom.
Did you know L. Clore Morton?
Yeah, and I liked Judge Morton, all right. He was a little more strict. In fact, one time when my crazy man,
What was your crazy man's name?
James Welch,
And what happened to him?
well, after 13 months, Judge Gray had to turn him loose. Had to turn him loose, because back
You
then the
wore
law
Judge
was,
Gray down.
huh?
You wore Judge Gray down.
Not back then, the law was that if you could not treat the person, you had to turn him loose. In fact, if Ronald Reagan had been shot anywhere except Washington, D.C., they probably would have just had to turn that fellow loose. But Washington, D.C. had the only facility where they could treat people. And they brought in, the government brought in a fellow, a psychologist from Springfield, Missouri. And it was real interesting because, as luck would have it, I found out about a psychologist out at Scarrett College who was just in town for a few weeks. I can't think of his name, it had a German name. He was a German. And he had written all kinds of books on psychology. And I got him to agree to be a witness. And we went down, and they brought in this fellow from Springfield, Missouri. Prior to that, we had been in, Judge Gray had to go to some judges meeting, and we were in Judge Morton's court. And my man jumped up on the counsel table, and with his fingers, he shot a few of the marshals, and Judge Morton didn't like that. So there used to be a big marshal named Rex somebody. Do you remember him? Was that from out in Goodlettsville?
I don't remember him.
Big guy, 6'7", something like that. And he ordered him to take my man out. And he took him out by putting one hand under his chin and one on top of his head, and drug him out in front of all the potential jurors. And so Judge Morton ruled that my man was sane, said he was sane. Had nothing wrong with him, and going to select a jury. And I said, well, Your Honor, where are we going to get the jury? And he said, well, we can get the jury. I said, we're not going to select these people that just witnessed that, are we? Well, Judge Morton said, well, you may be right. You may have to not do that. So we didn't select a jury, and we got back in front of Judge Gray. And I told Judge Gray, he said, well, now Judge Morton has already ruled he was competent to stand trial. And I said, he did, Your Honor, but the reason he did was we had a fellow come down here who went to TSU, to Harry Medical College, and he testified as an expert, and he's a fellow that went into public service because he didn't want to go into the military. And what he wants to be is a urologist. And he got on the stand and testified as a neurologist. He said, Mr. Ballow, you mean neurologist? I said, no, sir. I mean urologist, and I know the difference. And he said, well, and the way I found that out was this guy came down to testify. and there was a reporter by the name of Jackie Srirachi.
Right.
You remember her?
I do.
And he asked her for a date, and they went to the Paramount Theater on a date, and he told her that. She called me and told me that he's not studying. He said he wants to be a urologist. So when I got him on the stand, I asked him. He admitted it. And I said, okay. And so Judge Gray, we had a 5-day sanity hearing. When it was over, Judge Gray ruled my man wasn't competent. And from that day on, every time I was in front of Judge Morton, he'd say, Mr. Ballow got me reversed in front of Judge Gray. And I never knew whether he was kidding or not. But he would say, Mr. Ballow got me reversed in front of Judge Gray. And of course, Judge Morton didn't have a competency hearing. My man just showed off and he did it. But my man was really...
Do you know where he is or what happened to him?
No, but he was homosexual, and he was everything. Joe Brown asked him one day, he said, we were trying to get him into some facility and get him to agree to go, and one of the questions Joe Brown asked him was, have you ever been a prisoner of war? And he said, yeah. I said, hey, James, you've never been a prisoner of war. He said, what are you talking about? I was in the Army and I didn't want to be there. That's got to be a prisoner of war. Well, there you go. But Joe Brown, he to this day won't get over it. He never got over it. But for a year or two after that, he would call my house and talk to my wife. And then one time, he did something in Cincinnati 2 or 3 years after that. And the lawyer up there called me and said, he said to call you. You got all these? I said, that's right. He said, well, I want you to look through and I said, no, wait, you don't understand. I've got to, if you want to look through them, fine. I'm through with it. So the lawyer came down and we set him in a room and gave him all the records, and I never heard any more about it. But after he left Nashville, the day after he left the Nashville, he went to Knoxville, walked into court in Knoxville, and one of his buddies or sweethearts were there, and they had stolen a bunch of television sets, and they were trying him, and he walked into the courtroom and announced that he was taking over the defense of these people, and they didn't know who he was or anything. But he was nuts.
Well, let me ask about the contributions that you think were most significant in your career that you were associated with. We've already covered the crazy guy. We've covered the newspaper strike up in New York, and that was fascinating. Are there other cases that you think, or other situations where you think that might have had a major impact in your life or in the practice of law?
Well, when I started practicing law, as you know, I mean, you tried every kind of case, every divorce case, and every kind of case that came about. And I think I would have to say, just in general, the dealing with people, and when I said earlier that that carrying a newspaper route was terrific for me, it really taught me how to deal with people, and that people were different. And now I will say this, I did not ever really enjoy divorce cases. I told somebody one time, you have to interview 3 times to get where they begin to tell you the truth. And I never really enjoyed that, but I learned a lot, and I learned a lot about people, and just generally, when I hear people talking about divorce today, I always say, whenever somebody came in for a divorce, generally, one or the other had already found the next one. And that was kind of the way it was. And I can't say but I learned a lot from it, and I learned a lot about the kids who were products of the divorces, how they suffered from it.
Right.
And I think all of that together kind of made it. I know that I always thought practicing law was a very honorable profession and a wonderful way to make a good living. And my son's a lawyer.
I want to follow up on that.
Okay.
You had a boy and a girl. You said your daughter is married to a lawyer.
Yeah.
You just said that your son, Brent,
Yeah.
is a lawyer. Where is he practicing?
Brent practiced here. He was with the firm for 14 years. Brent went to college for 10 years. And he taught statistics at the University of Tennessee for 3 years. He got a BS degree and an MBA degree and a law degree. And he practiced here for a period of time. But back about a year ago, 18 months ago, Brent called me one Friday afternoon, and he is a real homebody. He don't, when they used to, when he was in college, they'd say, "What are you going to do when you get out of college?" He'd say, "Go home." That was his whole goal. He he got a call. I got a call, and he said, "Dad, I've just taken a job with Uber as Director of Employment Law for North America." And I said, "Son, I don't even believe that." He said, "Yeah, I did." He said, I just couldn't turn it down. Said, "They've been talking to me for 2 or 3 months." And he said, I kind of made up my mind how much money it was going to take to get me to take this job. And he said, their offer was a whole lot more than I had decided on. So I couldn't turn it down. And he said, "You got stock options and everything." And I'll tell you, he is the happiest guy in the world. His job is Director of Employment Law for North America, for Uber. And he just loves it. He just.
Does he live in Nashville?
Well, he lives here, but he's got
Travels.
apartments in 4 or 5 cities, and he travels around and.
Like you did.
Yeah,
Like you did.
Yeah, and he Brent was, you know, he's a smart kid, and he likes doing what he does. My granddaughter, I might tell you, is in her last year of law school
Where?
at the University of North Texas.
Good.
She had a situation where she developed Crohn's disease, and my daughter married a Jewish boy, and this disease is associated with the Jewish people. I didn't know that.
I didn't either.
And they've told her she couldn't go to law. She got accepted. She wanted to go for reasons to University of Iowa. And she got accepted, and she went. And the first day of law school, she fell out, and they had to take her to the hospital, and they discovered she had Crohn's disease. So she had to go back to Dallas, and they told her that she couldn't go to law school because the stress of law school would cause this problem, episodes. And so she went back, and her mother and daddy didn't even know about it, and she went down and applied at the University of North Texas Law School, got accepted, and she's in her last year there now.
That's great.
And she made good. She's working. She's done an internship at the DA in Dallas, and they can't give but one internship, so she just got another internship at the DA's office in Denton. The DA office in Dallas called them in Denton and told them that they should give her an internship, so she got it, and so that's it. Her daddy, my son-in-law, is a very, very successful lawyer in Dallas, and does extremely well.
What kind of law does he practice?
He just litigated. He'd litigate anything you got, and he does extremely well.
Now, you just have one grandchild?
5 grandchild.
Oh,
I have Brent, my son, has 3 boys. And one of them is a scientist in North Carolina, and his specialty is he's a hydrologist, an expert on water, works for an outfit called Golder, Golder, just got married. And I have another one who, the smartest person in our family is the youngest boy. He went to the University of Tennessee. I think he made 1B the whole time he was there, and he got a double major in computer science and math. And when he got out, I said, Andrew, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going and get an advanced degree in applied mathematics. I said, that sounds good. Well, he got out, and his mother is a teacher at Harding Academy. And he got over there and got to working on computers, and that's what he does. Now, he teaches at Harding Academy and works in their IT stuff. But he's just 24 or something, so he's got a little time to fix what he wants to do. And then Brent's oldest son, and I talked to your son about it, he's working on his PhD at Auburn University. And my other grandson, Tina's other boy, is a big, good-looking boy. He's 6'5" tall, and he went to Purdue. He got a BS degree and an MBA degree, and he works now, since about the last 2 weeks, for St. Vincent's Hospital Group that owns St. Thomas and Baptist Hospital. And he, as a sidebar, I went down to visit Tina Thanksgiving. And when I went in, I said, how are things going? She said, oh, well, I said, Max, Max is changing jobs again. He graduated, in 3.5 years, he's had 6 jobs.
Whoa.
So after about the 4th time, I gave him a talking to. And I said, son, you can't just keep changing jobs. And he said, well, Granddaddy, I always get more money. I said, I know that, and that's good. But I said, you're going to do it. So he left St. Vincent. He went to work for Indiana Health, which is connected to Indiana University. And St. Vincent called him back and said, wanted to talk to him. And he said, I knew they wanted to talk to me. And said, I'd made up my mind I wasn't going to do it. But said, when we had lunch, they offered to double my salary. And he said, I couldn't turn it. I said, well, let me tell you about your granddaddy. I'm going to always be your granddaddy, but I ain't going to always be right. You did the right thing if they doubled your salary. So he got married about a year ago, and he's on his 6th job, and but he's manager of the finance department for St. Vincent's Hospital, is the way I understand it, and he's just doing great. So all my grandkids are doing great. They're all well educated.
Well, I'm going to kind of get close to the tail end here. I know about 2 or 3 years ago you were honored by your law school.
Yeah.
And I know that you have very fond affections for the Nashville School
I
of
do.
Law. Are you involved at all at the Nashville School of Law?
Well, I have lunch with Bill Koch occasionally, and I have just agreed to endow a program they've started out there called Excellence in Writing.
I'm participating in that.
Huh?
I'm participating in that.
Well, I agreed to endow that, and I am very interested in it because I think, I don't know what's wrong. They've had very poor ratings in passing the bar, and I've talked to Bill about it. You know, people put an awful lot of emphasis on how you get in, what it takes to get into law school, and I think they ought to put more in what it takes to get out. I don't know what the problem is, but I think Bill Koch can straighten it out.
Good.
And I appreciate so much the legal education that I got, and it was quality education. And I'm not sure that everybody looks on the night law school today with that same feeling. And when I started practicing law, I remember Frank King telling me when he said you ought to go to night law school, he said the best lawyers in Nashville went to school there. We had Jack Norman Jr., Joe Binkley, R.B. Parker, all of those, they were great lawyers. And they all went to the night law school. And I just don't know what's happened. I don't know why it's like it is, but there's got to be an answer to it. And I've always been very interested in the writing. We get so many people, and still have them, that are they're just sorry at trying to write. And when I used to hire people, I'd give them 2 books, one Strunk and White, and the other one on writing well. And I'd say, the first day of your work, you go in a room there and read both those books. It had to be, I don't know what it is, but it's something that needs to be looked into. And as I say, I think Bill Koch can fix it. But it's hard to understand. I can't remember, when we took the bar, I only remember one person in our class that didn't pass. Everybody passed. And I think it's just a difference in maybe, people, I think a lot of people just go to law school to perpetuate childhood, and they don't really understand or know what it's like. That's why I told my granddaughter, get internships, go over to the courthouse,
Find out.
be involved, find out, understand that, don't be scared of the judge, because they're just lawyers that wanted to be judges.
That's right.
And when you go into the courtroom, and this, I think we do have lawyers that practice this. I've always said, you be sure you know more about the facts and more about the law than anybody in there, including the judge. And I know how hard you worked, because I had a mutual friend over there. Jack Gunner was over there. And he used to talk all the time about how hard you worked and how conscientious you were in doing the right thing and doing the right job. And I wasn't surprised at that, because I've known you for some time, and I wasn't a bit surprised at that. But maybe we don't have the same kind of people today that are on the bench. But I was talking to a young lady who was in a visiting county here, and she was defending and had a pro se plaintiff. And the judge just got up and ate her out about the fact that she had served this person with interrogatories and all. And he said, well, you got a pro se plaintiff. I said, you do, let me tell you what you do. The judge was probably putting on an act for the pro se plaintiff. But what you do is you get the book out and you go right by the book. You do it just the way you're supposed to do it. And if he wants to do something outside the rules for the pro se, that's fine. But you go right by the books. But I never had, I've described to you the experience I had with Judge Gray, but I never had a judge in Davidson County. I won't mention, I had one judge in my lifetime that I thought was dishonest. The rest of everybody, Raymond Leathers would put my guy in jail, and we'd go have a cup of coffee together. And we had such good people as judges. They were always courteous from the bench, treated you with respect, and I just don't think it's that way. I may be wrong, but I don't think it's that way today. I just don't think the judges are as considerate as they used to be, but I don't know. Maybe they are.
Well, let me ask. I know that you said that you retired 4 years ago. You have an
No, I hadn't retired.
Not
I
retired?
resigned.
Resigned, excuse
From
me,
the firm.
resigned. that's a better way to put it,
Yeah.
resigned. And you have a daily schedule where you come in every day. You have your assistant. What are the current activities besides working on the endowment in the writing program over at the National School of Law are you involved in?
Well, I'm involved with a lot of
And Romeo, the Romeos.
I'm involved with some people I've met over the years, and who own newspapers, and who worked for Cap Cities ABC, who have a lot of money. And there was one fellow with the Cap Cities ABC, of course they made them rich, that was their whole pitch. But he went to work for Cap Cities when he was 17 years old, and over in West Virginia. So that was one of their first television stations. And he graduated from high school. He was the second employee they had. And he went and borrowed $200 at the bank and bought Cap City stock for a nickel a share. Wow. And of course he had a lot more than that. But you know how much he sold that stock for?
No idea. How much?
$770 a share when they went with Disney. But he had a lot of money. And these guys got millions of dollars. And they're going to look at buying television stations and stuff like that. And this afternoon, when we get through, I'm leaving to go out of town to meet with some of them. And I'm doing that, and I'm enjoying it.
That's wonderful. What do you see as far as the next few years, besides helping people to acquire other investments? That's pretty amazing. What are the other challenges you're looking forward to?
Well, I don't know that there are other challenges, but I would like to continue my relationship with people that I've worked with, clients over the years. And of course, I'll be 87 in August, so they're bearing a lot of my friends. And I would just like to continue to develop that. And, you know, it's really and truly, I don't mean this, but it's not a matter of making any money or anything. I've got enough money to live on. It's a matter of the challenge of working out the deals and putting people together. And one of the things that I bring that you build over the years, and I hope this is true and I'm proud of it, is I have really, really good relationships with all the people I ever represented. And if these people want to buy a newspaper, they like for me to be the one to introduce them to the people and say, this is it. And if somebody wants to sell the newspaper, you know, they can say that I know people who buy them. And I consider that an ongoing challenge.
I think that is an ongoing challenge, and it's also a rewarding experience when
Yeah.
you're involved in the deal.
Yeah.
What questions or question should I have asked you that I didn't ask you?
Gee, I can't think of any. I've enjoyed reminiscing and talking about a lot of these things.
Not as much as I've enjoyed listening.
But, you know, there's a lot of experiences you have as a lawyer that are funny, and yet they're serious too. And I guess some of the funniest things, talking about my crazy man case, I was going to tell you this a while ago, he decided that he didn't want to be in, Judge Evans, who used to be the U.S. Marshal, would take him to Columbia and put him in jail every day. And he decided one day he didn't want to be in the Columbia jail. So he started calling me, and he started calling Judge Gray, and he started calling everybody. He wanted to come back to the jail in metropolitan Nashville.
Was it Jack Evans?
Huh?
Jack Evans? Is
Yeah,
that who it was?
Evans, Judge Evans. And so I thought that alone would be proof that he was crazy, that he wanted to come back to the Metro jail. But anyway, he kept calling and calling, and I told him, I said, Jim, I don't have a thing in the world to do with where you're in jail. That's up to Judge Gray. Well, he won't take my, I said, well, that's it. He said, well, if you don't get me back to the Nashville jail, I'm going to burn this jail down. So I said, well, I can have it. So I hung up and I called the sheriff down there and I told him, or somebody, you better watch this guy because he's crazy. And he called me, the last time he called me was about 7 o'clock at night. And I said, I can't do anything about it. You're there. And the next morning I got up and the headlines on the Tennessee, Murray County Jail burned.
I remember that fire.
And so, boy, Judge, we had to go back to Judge Gray. And we stood in front of Judge Gray, and they got up and explained that he had burned the jail down. And Judge Gray said, well, Mr. Ballow, what have you got to say? Judge Gray approached it like you had done it, you know. Okay, Mr. Ballow, what have you got to say? And I stood up and said, well, Your Honor, he told him he was going to burn the jail down. And he said, is that statutory law? Is that common law? But can you cite me a case where he said he'd do burning the jail down if he told them? I said, no, sir, but they ought to take the matches away from him. And Judge Gray, he never forgot that. He always recited me saying that take the matches away. But like I say, that was a pretty serious matter, but it was funny too. And
It was a very serious fire.
yeah. Let me tell you, the other funny thing about him was Judge Gray had to turn him loose. And Joe Brown and I went in the office in chambers, and we argued. I said, Judge, you got to turn it. You can't hold him. The law says you can't. And Joe Brown said, and I had an order there to release him. And Joe Brown said, Judge, if you turn him loose, all he's going to do is go into somebody else's jurisdiction and do the same thing. And Judge Gray said, you said the magic words. Go into somebody else's jurisdiction. And he signed it. And what was so funny, he turned my man loose, and about 2 hours after he turned him loose, I got a call from First American National Bank. He was over there wanting to cash a check using me as a reference. I said, no way, no way, don't do it. Oh, man.
Well, on behalf of the Nashville Bar Association and the Nashville Bar Historical Committee, the Legal History Project members, I want to say thank you. Not only thank you for participating in this interview, but I think if anyone takes the time to listen to what you have said, they would thank you for your service to the bar, to the legal profession, and to society for everything that you've done, because your story is remarkable, and I know there were a bunch of questions that I didn't ask you. I didn't even think about talking about Jack Gunter. Your association with so many lawyers that you've mentioned, we didn't explore that. You have such a fabulous and tremendous career, and you have made so many contributions. The last one, I think you mentioned, being at the Nashville School of Law with the writing project that they have, that thanks probably is very insufficient word to say what gratitude we should all convey to you.
Well, Chancellor, I'll tell you, I feel it's mutual, because I feel like I owe a whole lot to the National School of Law, and I owe a whole lot to the legal profession. And I really treasure the friendships of the other lawyers that right today when we go to the Romeo Club, I think about it, you couldn't put together a finer group of people, and I enjoyed, and I've enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.
Okay.